Anxiety is our body's attempted adaptation to a stressor or stressors. When we go through those things, our body, our mind, our nervous system, our behavior, our habits, our cravings, our thoughts, our choices, our gut microbiome, our immune system, our hormones, everything jumps on board to try to help us adapt. Are those adaptations getting stuck? Is there a stickiness to the adaptations? Or do we continue to evolve and adapt so that we're in time? In naturopathic medicine, we take that 10 steps further. We look beyond the nervous system. We say, well, what is the immune system doing? What is the gut microbiome doing? What are the adrenal glands doing? What is the level of inflammation in the brain doing? We know there's a microbiome in the brain. What are those bugs doing?
Welcome to the Mind Health 360 show. I'm Kirkland Newman, and if you, your loved ones, or clients suffer from mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, insomnia, poor memory, poor attention, mood swings, exhaustion, etc., I interview the leading integrative mental health practitioners from around the world to help you understand the root causes of these symptoms, many of which may surprise you and suggest solutions to help you heal. If you like this interview, please do subscribe and forward to others who might find it helpful. If you want further information, please go to www.mindhealth360.com or find us on social media. Dr. Nicole Cain, welcome to the Mind Health 360 show. I'm so thrilled to have you here speaking about such an important topic and speaking about your new book, which is called Panic Proof, which is brilliant. It's an encyclopedia, not just on how to deal with panic, but any sort of anxiety, really. And so panic is sort of it's a neat little alliteration, but actually it's really anxiety, panic, anything to do with your nervous system, essentially. So it's absolutely brilliant. So let me just introduce you. You are a naturopathic doctor. You have a master's in naturopathic health. You're a pioneer in integrative approaches for mental and emotional wellness. You also have a degree in clinical psychology. You've got training in EMDR and a license as a naturopathic physician in the state of Arizona. Your approach to mental health is multidisciplinary, medical, psychological, and holistic. So in fact, your MA is in clinical psychology rather than in naturopathic health, but you have both. So it's wonderful because you really bridge the gap between the biochemical from your naturopathic perspective and the psychospiritual with your clinical psychology degree. And you really managed to merge the two very, very effectively. And that's one of the things that I loved about your book was really that mix between, what can you do about your biochemistry and what is maybe causing your anxiety and your panic, both from a biochemical perspective, but also from a psychospiritual perspective. And how do you tackle both? So thank you so much for being here. And let's get right in, because I know a lot of people are keen to figure out, that anxiety is a growing epidemic in our society. And I think people say, since COVID, anxiety has been so much worse. But I actually think anxiety has been growing. If you look at the trends and the statistics, especially in young people, anxiety was growing way before COVID. Obviously, COVID exacerbated things, but it's just on a sort of exponential growth curve. So well done for writing this book, and thank you, because it's an encyclopedic, and there's so much information here. So first of all, what would you say is the difference between anxiety and panic? So you called it panic proof, and a lot of it is about anxiety. What is the relationship between panic and anxiety?
Thanks to the trauma-informed model, we have an opportunity to look at it with, I think, fresh eyes, where in the DSM, which a lot of the people who listen to this podcast, they know that this is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It's the great big purple book that we use for diagnosis of mental health, like generalized anxiety disorder or panic disorder. And in that book, they look at it as separate, distinct entities, where generalized anxiety is where you just feel anxious more days than not. There may be spikes in that anxiety, versus they would describe panic disorder, panic attacks, as really extreme panic or anxiety that comes out of the blue. But when we actually look at what the research is showing us is that number one is very rarely does panic come out of the blue. There are typically indicators which are unique to every individual. And the second is that a lot of the research that we see out there suggests that anxiety can actually be in many cases resolved, whereas the old model suggests that you just have to live with it. It's a part of the human experience. We have to live with it. And so in this book, we talk about a more trauma informed and more holistic perspective of what anxiety and what panic are and what they're actually doing. And so, one is that a better way to look at panic and anxiety instead of as completely separate diagnoses is to look at it on a continuum or on a spectrum where a little bit of calm, a little bit of arousal kind of mixed together, just kind of a little something that's underneath of the surface, maybe at one end of the spectrum, where on the other end is just crisis state. And so I teach about this in the stoplight strategies where you visualize the green light, you feel calm, you're in your ventral vagal, you feel relaxed, your nervous system is activated, it's creative, but you're not feeling stressed, you're not feeling anxious or depressed or irritable, you're just cool. And then the yellow zone is when you start to notice that your body is shifting. And so some people, they feel that canary, if you will, in their head. Their thoughts may start going more quickly. For me, it's always in my chest. Do you have a canary, Kirkland? Like when you first notice, like, ooh, we're kind of kicking into yellow?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, it's also in my chest, ironically, and I always feel like this tightening in my chest, and I always think,
Yeah.
do I have angina? Because my parents both have heart problems. I think is this a heart problem? Is it a lung problem? And I start then to catastrophize. So yeah, mine is not good.
Yeah, it starts in the body. You get the chest anxiety, and then the thoughts kick in, and you have the curse of knowledge, if you will. So you know all of these bad things it could be. But there's this interesting statistic, which I talk about in the book, where when we looked at the individuals who were going into the emergency department afraid that they were having a heart attack, is that 80% of those cases, it was a panic attack. So your experience is pretty common in terms of how extreme it can be. And so in your yellow light zone, you start to notice like, ooh, my chest is getting a little angina, getting a little tightening. And then if whatever it is that's causing that, whether it be mold or a fight that you're in with another person or worry about your kids or whatever it is, if that source of stress doesn't get resolved or if we don't manage it, it will keep amplifying into the red light zone, which is crisis. And so that's when we use our crisis strategies. And I think that's what a lot of people just assume is if I'm not in crisis, then I don't have anxiety. But really, it's a whole spectrum in between.
That makes total sense. So in fact, it's a continuum, and panic is one edge of the continuum and anxiety is the other. And the other thing you said, which I think is fascinating, is that it starts in the body, because there's so much sort of positive psychology and, all this sort of manifesting and all these ideas that, you generate these thoughts, which then cause anxiety or depression. It's your belief systems that then cause these mental health manifestations. Whereas I think, a lot of the latest research have shown that actually that's not the case, that your thoughts come from your state and your bodily state, the state of your nervous system. And would you agree with that, or do you think it's a bit of both?
I just got off a call with a patient before you and I got on this podcast, and he has graduation tomorrow. And he's been working so hard to get to this point. He's getting his associate's degree. He's almost 30. So he's had to work really, really hard. And there's been a zigzag to get there. And right now, he's in bed every single day, all day for the past week, and he can't get out of bed. And they don't think he's going to be able to make it to graduation. So they called me today. And he's like, I just can't. What if they don't let me graduate? Or what if I can't find where I'm supposed to go? And so I'm like, okay, so those thoughts are there, but what's the main thing? And he's like, I feel terror in my chest. And he said, when I get out of bed and I think about getting dressed and showering, that terror becomes so big that I have to get back into bed. And his mom is like, but nothing is going to happen. And you know that. And you know that if you can't figure out where to go, that will help you, that there's people there that will help you. You know that logically. And he's like, yeah, I do. And she's like, and yet you refuse to get out of bed. And this is, I think, the conversation that a lot of people have is like, why can't I talk myself out of feeling anxious? It's like playing a game of whack-a-mole. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
those little
Yeah.
marmots come up, you make it go away, and then another one comes up. And I think it's exactly what you're saying, is that our body doesn't necessarily care what is logical. In fact, we could get into the whole neuroscience of that, which we cover in the book quite a lot. But trauma gets stored in non-logical, non-verbal parts of the brain. Our gut microbiome, we inherit that from our biological mother, that can predispose us to anxiety. Our epigenetics, our nutrition, environmental chemicals, they don't really care how positive we are. We have to work with the body.
That's so right. And I'm so with you on that. And that brings me, I guess, to my next point, which is, first of all, I mean, what is anxiety in some ways from a neurophysiological perspective? Like, what does it look like from a neuroscience and a neurophysiological perspective? And leading on from that, like, what are the factors, the key factors that cause this anxiety?
Anxiety is our body's attempted adaptation to a stressor or stressors. And a metaphor, before we get into the science piece, a metaphor for those listening would be, if you go to Switzerland and it's very cold and snowy, your body will be very cold and it could be very dangerous if you don't adapt to that temperature and put on a coat. And so similarly, when we go through any number of stressors or triggers, or we call them diatheses, which we can get into more in a moment. But when we go through those things, our body, our mind, our nervous system, our behavior, our habits, our cravings, our thoughts, our choices, our gut microbiome, our immune system, our hormones, everything jumps on board to try to help us adapt, just like putting on that coat. But if you then go to the Maldives and it's very warm and you're sitting out in the sun and the temperature is 80 degrees Fahrenheit and you keep that coat on and you don't continue to adapt, then that coat that was helpful, maybe even life-saving for you, is now causing you suffering, is causing you problems. And so it's all about an adaptation. And are those adaptations getting stuck? Is there a stickiness to the adaptations? Or do we continue to evolve and adapt so that we're in time with our present? And that's the bones of a lot of what our trauma work is doing. Somatic work, the neurosequential model, EMDR is helping get the body back on track with the presence. But then in naturopathic medicine, we take that 10 steps further. We look beyond the nervous system. We say, well, what is the immune system doing? What is the gut microbiome doing? What are the adrenal glands doing? What is the level of inflammation in the brain doing? We know there's a microbiome in the brain. What are those bugs doing? And we look at those factors.
Well, that's what I love about this, what you bring together, which is essentially both, sides of the coin, which is the naturopathic and the psychospiritual. And I find, we talk about trauma as a maladaptation in some ways. So it's, the body stores a traumatic event and then reacts inappropriately, because reacting, if you react appropriately, like you fight or you flee or you freeze, those might be very appropriate reactions to what you're going through. But usually, in our current state, if we have this stuck trauma, this stuck energy, then it's maladaptive, meaning that we overreact or we underreact based on what we're storing, which we haven't processed. So the sort of stuck energy that we haven't processed. And in a way, what you're saying is it's the same thing with anxiety. It's a sort of maladaptive response, which is disproportionate to the environment. Because presumably, I mean, look, anxiety can be warranted, right? Panic can be warranted. And if you're, running from a saber-toothed tiger, then or you're having an altercation with your spouse or your boss, you go into a stress response, which I assume is, it's an adaptive response. So what you're saying, if I understand correctly, is that it becomes dysfunctional and it becomes detrimental when it's maladaptive to your external circumstances. Is that correct?
Yes. And to add just a little bit to what you said, is that it is initially adaptive, but if it doesn't continue to be adaptive, then it's maladaptive. So I grew up in a family where there was a lot of stress. There was a lot of inherited violence. There was a lot of uncertainty. And so one of the ways that I responded to that is to become very hypervigilant. I could tell if someone was mad before they would even come out with it. I could see the subtle changes in their body language, the twitch of an eyelid, the shifting of the shoulders, the tone of voice. And that was an adaptation at that time because it enabled me to then either flee and get away, get out of that place, or it enabled me to fawn and try to appease and cheer up or make that person happy to try to reduce the risk of violence or unsafety. And that adaptation got me through that circumstance. But then later in life, when I was in medical school, a teacher once said to me, he said, one thing I love about you, Dr. Cain. And I said, oh, I want to be loved. Tell me more. And he said, you never say no. And I was like, oh, shoot, that's actually bad. And so that impression management, that desire to appease other people, that hypervigilance to everything everybody else needed, and then relinquishing my own choice and priority and self-care for others is now maladaptive because I'm now wearing a coat where it's not cold. So it's that shift between adaptive into maladaptive because it doesn't continue to change.
That makes total sense. And so if we look at anxiety and panic, so what are the key factors that predispose us or can trigger anxiety and panic? I mean, there's so many, and you name them all in your book, but give us a few of the key ones, whether they're biochemical or lifestyle behavioral. You talk a lot about hormone imbalances and nutrition imbalances and neurotransmitter imbalances. And you also talk about these 9 types of anxiety, which I found fascinating. So do you want to talk about the 9 types of anxiety first, or do you want to talk about sort of the causes? Are they different, the causes, according to what type of anxiety it is?
I'd like to start there. I think that's actually a brilliant place to start, is what you said. The gift of the 9 types of anxiety is it allows us more space for research and development into the root causes of anxiety, in addition to providing more targeted treatments. And so the idea came from working with clients for over a decade. Everybody's experience of anxiety was different. Some people would come in and they'd say, when I'm anxious, I just want someone to reassure me, give me a cup of tea, and just tell me everything's going to be okay. And maybe like open the windows and just make everything okay. Some people are like that. Other patients that came in when they had anxiety, the person I was just talking about, his anxiety is showing up with zapping neurological pain in his head. He gets this jolt of pain when he's anxious. He gets this sudden jolt. And so these individuals, everyone experiences it just a little differently. And it doesn't make sense that everybody gets the same treatment. Where you go into the doctor, the standard medical care, the standard medical approach is antidepressants, positive psychology or cognitive behavioral therapy, and benzodiazepines. And they are not without their limitations. And we also know that the chemical imbalance theory was debunked in 2022. And so for most people, changing their neurotransmitters pharmacologically isn't going to work, and people can do better. So if we just step back and we look at the way anxiety presents in people, we can reorganize it into approximately 9 systems. And those I call the 9 types of anxiety. And so if we look at those systems, we can see what are some of the root causes of this. We can look and see what treatments are going to work better. So I'll go through those 9 types really briefly here. So the first one is thought anxiety. And so you talked about that. You get that feeling in your chest, but then your thoughts start going. And so those who have intrusive thoughts, racing thoughts, obsessive thoughts, I often see thought anxiety in people who needed to adapt in a way that their brains had to be 10 steps ahead of everybody else. They had to be fast. They had to be forward thinking. Oftentimes we see in trauma that you can't focus on one thing. You have to be aware of everything that's happening around you. And so inattention is good in some environments, but then when you go and you're in public school and the teacher wants you to do math for 45 minutes and you can't focus, suddenly that's maladaptive. And then we have OCD and other types of thinking patterns. And then there's some treatments that work great for that don't work for chest anxiety. Yeah.
Can I ask you one question about that? Because when you talk about
Yeah.
inattention, I've always been fascinated by the link between ADHD and the overdiagnosis of ADHD and anxiety and trauma. So do you feel that ADHD might be a maladaptive response to fundamental anxiety and possibly thought anxiety?
I think that ADHD is an adaptive response that can then become maladaptive depending on the environment. So maybe somebody inherited a gene that was useful in their lineage that encodes dopamine. And so dopamine, we know in the clinical studies, especially in the prefrontal cortex, is important for helping us process and study. But maybe 6 generations past, your ancestors, it was not safe for them to just focus and study. And so there's this genetic trait that enabled them to survive. And then you inherit that genetic trait. But then in the 21st century, you're not out in the same environment and you inherit this gene. And then you go to a typical school instead of like a Montessori school, which we have here in the US, that kind of allows kids to learn their own way and not necessarily like sit in a classroom with rows of desks. So we have this past adaptation that in certain environments are maladaptive. But the question is it that the person is broken, or is it that the person is unable to function in a broken system?
Yeah, for sure. 100%. Okay,
Yeah.
continue. And then
Yeah.
I guess one other question before you move on, and I mean, I'll have to go quickly because we have so much to cover, but
Yeah.
things like health anxiety, people who are obsessed with their health and they're always catastrophizing and thinking that they might have cancer, they might have some terrible disease, and they're hypochondriacs. I say this because I'm one of those people, but would you categorize that under thought anxiety?
Yeah.
You
Yeah. It's thought specific to health.
Yeah.
And so for the question is it the chicken or is it the egg? Did something happen that provoked that? Like I had a patient, she never had any anxiety that was noteworthy until she was in kindergarten, and the little kid sitting next to her vomited all over his desk suddenly one day in class. And then from that moment on, she was so scared of every little sensation that she had in her body that meant that she was getting sick. So she had health anxiety. And so there's a lot more nuance to that, where then we're like, okay, well, what's happening with the brain's interoceptive processing, the sensing and feeling of what's happening in the body, and then interpreting that through a highly activated amygdala. Like there's more nuance to that. But, we want to think of where in the beginning of the timeline did health anxiety start for you, and what was going on at that time, and what is that health anxiety trying to tell you is out of balance and needs to be recalibrated.
That's so interesting because the interception that you mentioned, I mean, it's so, if so I'll just basically, any sensation in my body that feels
Mhm.
out of balance, and all day I'm scanning my body thinking, I have
Mhm.
muscle fasciculations and I have tremor because of mold exposure. And there's this constant in the back of my mind, oh, could I have ALS or could I have MS or Parkinson's? Because those are symptoms, right? And so, it's been going on for 3 years, so knock on wood, it's okay. But it's always, and so there's this constant scanning of the body and this hypervigilance, which is itself very anxiety producing, so it's fascinating. But what you're saying, if I understand correctly, is that the thoughts are secondary to these bodily sensations, which are then maybe normal body sensations, but then our thoughts are superimposed and we interpret these negatively. Is that how it works?
I think it could be bidirectional. I think that it for that little girl I was talking about, she saw something and then had a thought like, "Oh my God, what if I get sick?" But then it sounds like what you were also describing is that you are very, very attuned interoceptively, and then you feel things. But then when that awareness goes into the brain is aroused in a way that it goes down maybe a more amygdala activated cycle as opposed to a more automatically going into your executive parts of the brain that are able to think rational and ignore it. There's
100.
uh there's something called the salience network, which is these areas of the brain. And the job of the salience network is to scan everything happening in your environment and everything happening in your body interoceptively, and then decide if that's relevant. And we get about 11 billion data points a second that the salience network has to filter. And if we are getting flooded and if we're getting overwhelmed, when in doubt, the salience network will send that on to the amygdala. And if the amygdala, the emotional processing part of the brain, is getting flooded, when in doubt, it's going to send that on to the autonomic nervous system and you're going to get stress hormone release. And so, if that's been the process for years and years and years, it's kind of like what the way your body has been programmed. And so then anytime there's a little bit of a something that's already been programmed down the danger pathway. And so you have to become aware of that process. And then we have to actually reprogram the mind, the body, the nervous system, and then all of the other adaptive systems so that it goes where you want it to go instead of down that fear cycle.
So interesting. And what's the relationship between the thalamus and the salience network? Because the thalamus, if I understand correctly, which you describe in your book, takes in all the information from the outside, the sensations, the smells, the sights, all the external
Mm-hmm.
stimuli, and then interprets it, I presume. So how does
Yeah.
that work?
You just hit the nail on the head. The thalamus is one of the parts of the brain associated with the salience network and does exactly what you said.
Got it. Okay, super.
Brilliant.
Okay, so we've spent way too long on the thought anxiety. We've got 8 more to get through, so tell us more. Yeah.
Chest anxiety is anxiety in your chest, heart, lungs, and then gut anxiety is anxiety in the gut. So it could be upper gut, so it could be heartburn, it could be burping, it could be indigestion, it could be lower gut, gas, bloating, diarrhea, constipation. And then knowing that something works in the gut will give us opportunities. Okay, if all of this anxiety is causing diarrhea, versus this person over here, all of their anxiety makes her feel like she's having a heart attack, we would do different testing on those people. I would probably send the chest anxiety person to a cardiologist to get examined. And the person who has tons of gut dysfunction, I would send them to a gastroenterologist. And so, not only in conventional medicine do we already have referral sources for specialists in that area, but then in functional and integrative medicine, naturopathic medicine, I'm thinking, okay, it's in the gut. Well, what's going on in the gut? Let's do stool analysis. Or it's in the chest. Okay, vagus nerve. What's going on with vagus nerve? Let's test vagus nerve tone. So the different areas give us opportunities for different deep levels of digging. Because otherwise, it's like spray and pray testing. And who wants to do all of the tests?
100%. So if I understand correctly, then are you saying that a gut imbalance, so maybe, issues with your gut, whether it's IBS or leaky gut or dysbiosis, are the causes of your anxious feelings? Or could it be that there are no real gut symptoms, but it's just anxiety? And same with the heart. Like there might, you might get the all clear from your cardiologist, but it's just that, that's where your anxiety goes. Or could your anxiety be causing constriction in your arteries or arteriosclerosis or contributing to? Or is it a bit of both?
This is such a good question because you're getting into the nuance of cause and effect, and it's a little bit of both. And I would also want to add to that is that most people have a little bit of mix depending on where they are in the stoplight. So for you and I, what we talked about is there's like that little canary in the chest. And then if we both were to have our own unique flavor of panic attacks, which hopefully neither of us do, we'll probably get a little like my stomach's upset, my muscles are tight, my thoughts are racing, my heart is pounding, I'm sweating. So we recruit more symptoms. And so the question with gut anxiety is, was it the chicken or was it the egg? Was it that antibiotic that I took 20 years ago and I have had a Clostridia infection ever since and didn't know it and everyone just gave me benzos? Or is it that my brain is trying to help me be in fight, flight, freeze because of something, a car accident that I was in, and then sending the signal and saying, hey, gut, we need to be in fight, flight, freeze. Can you go and deal with our hormones over there and cause cortisol to be released? Oh, also, can you help regulate this immune system activation? Because we need some histamine, because that histamine is going to help us get away from danger. And the gut's like, I got you, boo, sends a signal back up to the brain. The brain's like, awesome, feedback loop, and then everything goes. So the arrow is bidirectional.
And so, what determines whether you're going to get chest anxiety or gut anxiety? And I'll let you finish with the other ones as well. But is it a genetic thing? Is it does each person have their own particular vulnerabilities that they're born with?
Yeah, I think it's a mix of nature and nurture. And if we were to get into the gloriousness of Ayurveda talks about how if, for example, you're in the desert, which is where I love to be. So if you're in the desert, everything is hot, everything is dry, you're drinking bubbly water. So we're thinking environment, we're thinking diet. Maybe you eat a bunch of popcorn. We're talking about my husband right now, actually. And then you put yourself into a vata state, and then vata states tend to have more anxiety, anxious thoughts, ADHD, gas, bloating, restlessness. And so in Ayurveda, our environment, our lifestyles can push us into a type of anxiety. But then also, like we were talking about, is our ancestors in the time of King Arthur, the adaptations that they needed in order to survive can influence the way that you feel in your body and the way things work now.
Totally.
But the cool thing about all of this is, so for those who are listening and their heads are exploding and they're like, oh my gosh, this is so overwhelming. How could I possibly change something from the time of King Arthur? Is that the mind, the body, the nervous system, and the adaptive systems are all changeable, and the body is designed to self-heal. And that's what your podcast is all about. That's what we do. That's what the book's all about. So I just want to throw out that level of hope while we're in the midst of it here.
100%, yeah, because I mean we're dwelling on the causes and but we will get to the solutions.
Yeah.
So what are the other types of anxiety? We've covered chest, we've covered gut, we've covered thoughts. What are the other ones?
Nervous system anxiety, so muscles, nerves, headaches, like anything in the nervous system, that would encapsulate chemicals like nervous system chemicals like dopamine and serotonin. And then there's anger anxiety. And so that's the fight part of fight, flight, freeze. There's depressive anxiety, which is more kind of the flop of fight, flight, freeze, flop, fawn, fracture. So it's, we feel helpless, we feel despairing, we feel maybe we're thinking about our exit strategy from this world. And so that can be real paradoxical because anxiety can cause that arousal and that activation, but we can have a mix of depression in there too. So that's depressive. And then trauma anxiety. And arguably, really, trauma or adversity or activators would be the umbrella over everything. But in cases where the main thing is something that happened to you or to someone that you love, and that you have nightmares about it, the anxiety started then, you have intrusive thoughts about that specific thing, then we want to specifically target the trauma first. So someone's coming in and they're getting terrible flashbacks about being in combat. My number one intervention isn't going to be, well, let's do a stool test and see what's happening in your gut. My number one intervention is going to be, let's do trauma informed therapies like somatic based or EMDR or internal family systems.
Yeah, so it really depends on each person's personalized circumstances, essentially background, etc. What your interventions
Yes.
will be. Yeah. And
Yeah.
then so have we covered off the 9? Have we I've
The
lost
last
track.
two are, I know, right? There's a lot. The last two are immune system anxiety, which is anxiety with the immune system, like histamine, and chronic autoimmunity or celiac. And then the last one is endocrine anxiety. So somebody could have been like all these women in the US who are on the West Coast were all getting hyperthyroid type symptoms like Graves' thyroid, thyroid cancer. And they tied that back to an environmental toxicant that had come over the ocean and it was affecting all these middle aged women. And so they were getting thyroid dysfunction. And then amongst the symptoms that they were experiencing was anxiety. And I wrote about Charlotte in the book, who had postpartum thyroid hyperthyroidism and was just told to take a benzo, and it was mommy stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's so true. And another question I wanted to ask you was about how phobias essentially fit into these types of anxieties, because some people have these specific phobias, which are sort of recurring, or they have OCDs, or they have, so how would you fit that into your model?
Yeah, I think it would make sense to bind it with more of an obsessive kind of compulsive OCD process where the nervous system and the brain, they're so associative. And these associations can happen outside of our cognitive awareness. So somebody, for example, may have been, let's say they were in third grade, they were in the car with their parent, and then they get hit by a red truck and they don't even remember this happening, but as an adult, they are terrified of driving on the highway. They have a phobia of driving on the highway, and they're like, I can't figure out why. So you take them out on the highway, and they're getting through it, and they're managing, but then a red truck passes or a red sedan passes. And the brain may notice that, even if you don't cognitively notice it, and it can be very activating. So when I think about phobias, I think about when did it start and what was the adaptation to? Was it an environmental stressor? Is it a smell? Is it something that happened? So those are hard because it can be so agonizing and painful to go into that. But one of the best things to do when it comes to panic and phobias is to go into those situations in a way where we can reprogram them. And I talk about the 4 steps for that. It's called the panic reset in the book. And that it's hard. I used to have a phobia of flying, but
Yes.
I fly now. And so we can do it.
And you got over that by doing neurolinguistic programming or by reprogramming? How did that work? Like, how do you go into fixing that essentially?
I wrote the book that I desperately needed when my symptoms of anxiety were at their worst. And I went to all the experts and I was asking them, how could I make this go away? How, please give me something to make the anxiety stop. Because at that time, I lost so much weight. I wasn't having my period anymore. I wasn't able to work without having involuntary muscle spasms and fasciculations and jerking. I wasn't sleeping. I was on all these medications, all these supplements. I'd done all these therapies and treatments, and I was going to everyone I could think of. How can I make the anxiety stop? And the answer wasn't in stopping the anxiety. The answer was in listening to what the anxiety was telling me needed healing and how. And when I got that answer and I started listening to what my anxiety was telling me and almost leaning into it, and there are steps for that process, but leaning into it as a friend or a helper or a companion, then I was beginning the process of reprogramming. And I didn't do NLP or anything specific like that. But all of the things that I tried started working better when I was coming at it from a completely paradoxical perspective.
Of surrender in some ways, right? Surrendering to it.
Yes.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
There's a lot of wisdom, age-old wisdom, talking about surrender and the importance of it. So you talk about this in your book quite a bit. You talk about, what anxiety or what our symptoms are trying to tell us. What are the changes that need to be made? And obviously for each person that's personal, but for you in particular, what was it that needed, because you did do all this, you were studying, you were very well versed in all this sort of naturopathic and psychological process, and yet nothing was really working. So what is it? So the missing piece for you was that you weren't, leaning into it, you weren't surrendering to it, and you weren't attuned to the messages that it was trying to send you. So what were those messages?
I needed a jobectomy. And so I teach about, and this comes from naturopathic, it's called the therapeutic order. And it tells us how to think like a vitalist. And a vitalist is somebody that looks at the body as a self-healing organism. And that by following the laws of nature, then the body can heal itself in many, many circumstances. And so that's giving the body what it needs. And that's what we love to focus on in functional medicine is like, just tell me what I can take. Tell me what diet to eat. Tell me what supplements and herbs to take. Tell me what psychobiotics I need to take. And we love to focus on that. But the second step in the therapeutic order is, what are your obstacles to cure? And so for somebody, it may be being in a moldy house and they can take every supplement and they can do every sauna. But if they're in that moldy house, it's an obstacle to cure. And for me, my metaphorical moldy house was the job that I was in. And so I graduated, I did a residency, I started a private practice. And the way that I had built that and the humans that I had created that with was, for me, where I was at that time in my life, it was like kerosene on kindling. It was a forest fire of disaster for my emotional well-being. And I had to quit. So I sold my half of the business and I left the state. I moved across the country. And that's, you and I were talking about that earlier. That was part of why I was like, all right, Paul, let's winter in Michigan. Let's do a giant pattern interrupt. And when I let go of what I thought I needed to say yes to, because I like to say yes, when I let go of that and started saying no, that's when everything else started working. So that was the obstacle to cure for me.
That's so interesting. Okay, so let's wind back to what I'm always obsessed with, which are, what are the root causes, the potential root causes? Now, you mentioned so many. You mentioned, obviously there is what you just spoke about is very profound because, that's a very essential root cause, which is that you were not living your right life. And so, if you're not living your right life, then that can really trigger a lot of anxiety symptoms. And that's more sort of from the psychospiritual realm, as I would call it. You've also talked about trauma. You've talked about adverse childhood experiences. Those are also root causes of anxiety. And then you've spoken about more biochemical things. You've spoken about mold. You've spoken about hormones. You've spoken about, taking an antibiotic, which might mess up your gut. Can you talk us through sort of the key for you, the things that you see most in your practice in terms of the biochemical and the psychospiritual triggers of anxiety or sort of root causes of anxiety?
Environmentally speaking, I see two main things. Is number one is environmental toxins, especially problematic in the United States, is that we see placentas now have plastics in them. It's just environmental toxins are everywhere. We're still putting food dye in our foods. I look at baby toys, they have plastics and dyes in them. I look at foods like, why does baby food need to have yellow number 7? It doesn't need to be a pretty color. The baby doesn't care. And then think about heavy metals. And so are you in a big city and there's exhaust, and then think about the way that the metals and the plastics will interfere with our hormones. And so, for example, when we're trying to do, let's say, puberty. So kids oftentimes will develop anxiety and depression in puberty. And so suddenly you have had they've been eating all this pizza and all this stuff that teens eat. You have teens, you know it, you've seen it. So they're eating all this inflammatory foods. We live in a very toxic environment. And now their body is trying to produce all of these hormones. They're going into puberty. So testosterone is rising, estrogen is rising. And in order to have that process go naturally and healthily, we need vitamins and minerals. We need detoxification. But we hit the ground with no shoes on our feet and we're running through the dirt, right? And so what's tricky with metals is a specific example, is that you can have all the right levels of hormones, but metals can look like minerals and they can get inserted in those biochemical pathways. And so women, especially, who come to me and they're like, everything has been terrible since I hit puberty, but every time I get my tests run, everything is normal. This is Esme's story. She had a polycystic ovarian syndrome, but a lot of that was childhood trauma and environmental toxicity. And so she needed a detox. So that's environmental. And then the other main environmental thing that I'm seeing, especially right now, is the salience network overload. Is everyone's on screens, kids are on social media, they're all constantly getting those dopamine hits. And that's changing the brain, which hasn't evolved to accommodate this level of input and technology. And so those are two environmental things.
Yeah, and you talk about it very eloquently in your book. You talk about this sort of overload, this information overload, which sort of overwhelms our amygdala. And I mean, the amygdala is constantly getting these stress messages of, being completely overexposed to stimuli, right? And so we're not designed to have that level of 24/7 stimuli, whether it's from pesticides or herbicides or, any of the sort of environmental toxins, but also stimuli from, as you say, the phone and the screens and the constant, even light. I mean, light that we have all the time. I mean, there's so much interesting research now coming out about blue light and how damaging it is to our mitochondria, and the blue light from our screens, which is very detrimental to our mitochondria. So, that's totally fascinating. And you talk a lot also about nutrition and diet and the importance of these cofactors in making the right hormones and neurotransmitters. And you run through all the different neurotransmitters, the dopamine and the serotonin. You're very interesting about serotonin because it's very nuanced. And so you really debunk the chemical imbalance theory. And you look at how serotonin can, either low serotonin can cause anxiety or high serotonin can cause anxiety. And, the key mediator seems to be inflammation. So if you're inflamed, then it will change the way you process serotonin. Talk to us a little bit about sort of the root cause from a neurotransmitter and from a hormonal perspective.
Yeah, the traditional theory is we discovered serotonin in the 60s. They called it enteramine. It was in the gut. And they're like, oh, this is so cool. And so they started studying it and studying it. Then they discovered Prozac not too long later. And there's this drug that could increase amounts of bioavailable serotonin in the brain. And then people started feeling a little bit better, although it took more than 20 studies to show that Prozac beat placebo. So it's not like great. But that was like, we had a hammer, everyone, we've got a hammer. And so that has been the foundation from which we have understood mental health quite largely, until we're seeing more research from the psychoneuroimmunologists and the trauma-informed therapists. And when it comes to serotonin, I think that there's a lot to be said about what else serotonin might be doing, as opposed to just making us happy, because more serotonin isn't necessarily better and less serotonin isn't necessarily worse. But now we get to start asking, well, why do some people feel better? Is it because it is changing something that's happening in the gut? Is it because it's going down this anti-inflammatory pathway because of something happening in this person's lifestyle that they respond better? Is it something to do with placebo because holy moly, the placebo is strong? And what are the vitamin cofactors? So genetically, we know that we need certain genes like MTHFR, methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase, in order to process and metabolize serotonin. And so maybe people who got serotonin, there was an issue genetically in that sense. And so that could be a different gene than the gene where somebody else has a bad reaction to Prozac. So I think that it's data. I just don't think that we drew the right conclusion. And I'm excited because now that we know we weren't right, we get to ask questions again.
So true. And the other thing I thought was fascinating was the number of, you know, sort of almost paradoxical responses that come up with each neurotransmitter and each hormone.
Yeah.
So if you have too much estrogen, it can make you anxious, but if you have too little, it can make you anxious. And if you have, same with progesterone, and, same with cortisol even. So eh, how do you sort of, I guess it's a question of balance, right? But I mean, all these
Yeah.
factors, what are the things that knock these neurotransmitters and hormones out of balance? What are the key sort of things? I mean, you mentioned toxins, you mentioned overstimulation and screens. Are there other things that knock these out of balance? Or, you mentioned also cofactors like B6 and D, and, your book is very clear on that you really need iron and magnesium and zinc to make these neurotransmitters and the hormones. But what are the key things that knock these out of balance?
Well, two answers. One is, in what way are the neurotransmitters being out of balance relevant? Because it may be that it's not as relevant as we think it is. We may be looking at the wrong thing. It's like, I'm looking in the refrigerator and I'm looking for the jar of pickles, but all I can see are jars of ketchup. And so all I see is the ketchup, and I'm looking at the wrong thing. I'm not finding what's right there in front of me. So the question is the relevance. And then the second question is, what if the neurotransmitters are out of balance? And if that being out of balance is problematic, what is that problematic imbalance and adaptation to? Because then if we just don't worry about trying to force the neurotransmitters, it's like if the door hinge isn't lining up and we just try to force it as opposed to taking the pins out and realigning the door. If we just reverse engineer them, we're like, oh, this happened. And then we treat that, then we're not going in and trying to fix everything downstream. It's like, just instead of pulling people out of the river, let's go upstream and just stop them from jumping in to begin with. And so that's leaning on the trust that if we give the body what it needs, if we remove obstacles to cure, if we restore weak and damaged systems, if we move blood and lymph, if we correct structural integrity, like your muscles and your spine alignment and things like that, if we believe that by following the laws of nature, the body will heal itself, then it takes away the pressure of having to do, I love doing oat testing and Dutch testing, but then I'm not having to look at a person and say, oh, your serotonin is a little high or your dopamine is a little low. I'm going to give you dopamine. Instead, I can say, well, what is that an adaptation to?
I
Does that make sense? Does that
Yeah,
resonate?
it makes total sense, and I love that approach because I think there's a danger in functional medicine that we get so we almost act like allopathic conventional medicine. It's like we test and we go
Hmm.
down silos and we get obsessed with this one molecule
Yeah.
and whereas I think the whole point of integrative medicine is that we look at the whole picture and we look at all the systems and how they interact, and so if we look at, you talk about the body healing itself, and if we move on to sort of the solutions, what are the best ways that we can approach anxiety and panic? So, somebody who has anxiety and panic, you talk about removing the obstacles and helping the body heal. So, what would be your approach in terms of, where do you start when somebody comes to you with anxiety and panic?
The book was the in the back of the book you get the panic reset, the panic proof process, the panic proof protocol, and so that will walk the person reading the book through the process of how to build a panic proof protocol. Think from, are there tests that I should run? How do I know which test? What is my type of anxiety? Where is the anxiety showing up? What's going on with my gut? And so it walks you through that process. What herbs might help me? What is the action that I'm looking for? So I walk you through the process. But if we were to just do a big zoom out for anyone listening to this conversation today who's like, I just need somewhere to start, is I would say something from mind, something from body, and something from spirit. And when I think about mind, is the most, I think, powerful opportunity that I see being missed for people right now is being seen and connecting with other people. I think so many people are so lonely and they feel so unseen. And sometimes it's not about what happened to you, sometimes it's about what didn't happen to you. And so not feeling connected, not feeling heard, not feeling seen. And so I would encourage those who are listening is find a friend, find a therapist, find a helper, find somewhere that you can go, maybe a place where you can connect spiritually, or a hobby, something where you can connect with other human beings. And if possible, if it is possible for you, doing that when you're in the presence of another human being, not just in a chat room if you can, or not just over the phone. Although sometimes that's what we have. And so do that, do what you can. But I would say number one is human connection. We see this. This is fundamental to survival. We see infants in the neonatal unit and the statistically significant differences in the healing of those infants who get touched and held and skin to skin versus those who do not have that. Humans need human connection. And right now we are all so distant, especially coming out of a pandemic. We aren't getting hugged and touched. We're not exchanging microbiomes. We're all afraid of everybody else's microbiome. So human connection. So that I would say. And then so and then connecting with something greater than yourself, I think is really powerful too. So I think that might be my second thing. And that's one of the gifts that's coming out of the psychedelic work, is that we're seeing that suddenly default mode network connectivity is reducing. And so that's this feeling of I'm stuck in myself, I'm self ruminating, I feel so alone, I feel so anxious. And we're seeing in psychedelic research that people are having this greater sense of connectivity with humanity, with the trees, with the divine, if they believe in the divine, with something greater than them. And so it doesn't have to be psychedelics, but it could be going to a garden. It could be going to church. It could be doing your own tarot reading. It could be whatever resonates with you, something like that. And then the last thing I think would be looking for what is getting in the way of you living the life that you want. What is your obstacle to cure? What who were you before the world told you who to be, and how can you become more of you? So those I think would be the top three things.
That's so interesting. And then, I mean, But it's interesting because to me, they're quite of the realm of the psychospiritual. And if we were to say, okay, well, somebody's anxiety is being caused because maybe they have a copper zinc imbalance, they have too much copper and that's interfering with their neurotransmitters and it's creating inflammation, or they have Lyme disease, or they have mold exposure, or they have had too many antibiotics as a child and their gut is completely destroyed. How do you think that and I've often wondered this, by essentially addressing the psychospiritual, does the biochemical in the body then get in balance? Or do you think you have to treat both simultaneously? Or can you have people who have absolutely no psychospiritual imbalances and who are perfectly healthy, but they get bitten by a tick, and then all of a sudden they develop Lyme disease and they become super anxious? But then people talk about a Lyme personality or a mold personality, and they say that people with trauma are more susceptible to these things. But what is your view in terms of the balance between these two as a practitioner? How do you sift through, how much to focus on the biochemistry versus the psychospiritual?
I think that they say, I don't remember who originated this, but disease cannot exist in a bliss-filled state.
Mm.
And I think about how in traditional naturopathic vitalism, we talk about vitality, which is being fully alive, and we talk about resilience, which is being able to withstand stressors in our environment. And so the question for each individual is, how can I make them more vital, and how can I help them become more resilient, and what's going to get them there? And so then we want to individualize that. And so the question is that going to be more on a biochemical, organic, physiological level, or is this going to be on more of a spiritual level? And I think that we could have really compelling answers for each side. And so for those who are listening, whether you're a provider or a patient, is lean into asking those questions and maybe incorporate a little bit of everything. It's like a buffet, and seeing what seems to stick. But I feel like personally, at least where I am in my journey right now, is that we have this soul in humanity right now, at least presently. And I think that we are so soul starved that I think we can make huge progress with that, as opposed to people not getting enough access to supplements or exercise. I think that, yeah, that has its place, but I think that a lot of that could. There's this study, let me tell you about this study. Is they were looking at individuals who lived in a fairly remote African tribe, and they lived off of mostly beans and rice. And so then the researchers looked at their health metrics. They looked at blood sugar, liver enzymes, all these different metrics. And based on those particular metrics, the people had the nutrients that they needed. So they did the study. They took people from the United States, and they were eating a standard American diet, and then they fed the people from the United States the same diet that the tribal people were eating. And the Americans suffered significant symptoms on their objective metric tests of nutrient deficiency. So the food that they were eating was the same, but one group suffered and one group didn't suffer. And so that's the concept of susceptibility and resilience. Is if I'm not absorbing nutrients, is there a way that I can improve someone's absorption of nutrients without just giving them a vitamin? And then, you know what I'm saying? So it's like going deeper.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, it makes me think about, in this tribe, was it because they hadn't had a diet of antibiotics and anti-inflammatories and contraceptive pills, and
Yes.
they're not surrounded by pollutants and, and chemicals and heavy metals and, maybe they have more active lifestyles. They're not on screens all day. I mean, do
Yes.
you think are these factors in our modern lifestyle, are those the things that are really killing us essentially?
Those are the diathesis, right? Those are so that model, for those who aren't familiar with it, is imagine that you have two cups and the cups are the same size. And if we just pour water into the cups, they'll hold the same amount of water. But if we fill one of those cups with ice cubes and then we try to pour water in them, the one with ice cubes will hold less water. And so, what this represents is the cup is your level of bandwidth to withstand stress or trauma or environmental toxins or whatever it is. And some of us come into life, and you probably know those people. It's like nothing seems to get to them. They can go out till 4 a.m. They can eat total garbage. They're totally stressed, whatever, and nothing bothers them. But then you like eat an unorganic apple and get hives, right? Like so like I may be more the latter. So then the ice cubes, those are the diatheses. So these are environmental plastics. These are childhood trauma. This is getting hit by the red truck. This is having an imbalanced gut microbiome because of an antibiotic or maybe herbal antibiotics or whatever. And so there's what you come into this world with, and then there's also what's happening in this world. And so what we wanted, and then the water getting poured into the cup is everyday stress. Yeah. So what we want to do as healers is figure out what those ice cubes are and how do we either drain the water out of the bottom of the cup, or how do we start taking those ice cubes in, or maybe even reduce the number of ice cubes that are getting into the cup to begin with.
Fascinating. No, I mean, it's exactly right. And so, and I guess the analogy to take that forward is if your cup is full of ice cubes and, you've got all this water in there and you're struggling really, that presumably in your book essentially is one of the things that really leads to anxiety and panic and also depression and any sort of these mental health symptoms, is this lack of resilience, this lack of adaptation. Yes. Because one of the things that you talk about in your book as well, which I love, is it's, which a lot of us know, is that it's not the stressor, it's our reaction to the stressor. And it's not the fact that we get stressed, it's our ability to then regain our composure. And it's that sort of seesaw between being in states of activation and sympathetic overdrive and then going back into parasympathetic. And it's like heart rate variability, like how adaptable are we? And people with lower heart rate variability are less resilient. And, it's all about that accordion of how adaptive and how resilient are we. And so if you were to sort of give us your key sort of, I mean, you've mentioned your top 3, but like if you were to try and help us as a species become more resilient, given all the stressors that we have in our environment and the fact that our terrain is becoming more compromised, where would you start? And I guess it's a silly question in the sense that it depends on a case-by-case basis. But generally, what are the key ways that you would help people, or the sort of key takeaways to help people build that resilience and that adaptability to the inevitable stressors that we have in our lives?
Well, let's go down the therapeutic order and we'll pick one from each, because that kind of teaches us how to think. And so give the body what it needs is number 1. And so what does our body need? We know the human body needs water, it needs oxygen, it needs laughter, it needs hugs, it needs fresh air, it needs to detox, it needs minerals, it needs vitamins. And so as you're thinking about your client or you're thinking about your own health, is what does my body need? And if you want to do functional testing to see where maybe there are weak spots, okay, so I have a VDR gene mutation, which means that I don't absorb vitamin D and process it well. So I know I'm going to need way more vitamin D than the average person. So give the body what it needs based on a functional test. That might be more vitamin D or whatever that is for you. Number 2 is remove obstacles to cure. So what in your life is getting in the way of you being vital, of you being healthy? For me, it was a specific job. It could be an environmentally toxic home. It could be a relationship. It could be a habit. Maybe you vape or there's too much alcohol consumption, right? So what is getting in the way of you healing? And then number 3 is tonifying weak and damaged systems. And so when we think about tonifying, we're thinking about strengthening. Just like you want to have good biceps, you go and you tone your muscles and do bicep curls. We want to have a toned brain. And so we can tonify the brain with herbs that have tropho-restorative action. Tropho is brain, restoration is the action. So like Avena sativa, gotu kola, centella. Liver, we want to tonify and strengthen the liver. When we live in a toxic world, we're asking her to do a whole bunch of work. Phase 1, phase 2, methylating. The liver has so many jobs. And so supporting the liver with green veggies, cruciferous veggies, calcium D-glucarate, turmeric, brassicas, fiber, things that help with the liver. And then correct structural integrity is go and get body work done. I'm a huge believer in medically recommended massage if that feels safe for you. I like gentle structural realignment, and I don't love high velocity personally in chiropractic. I think that could be a lot for the nervous systems, but I like very gentle alignment of the spinal column and the peripheral. And then move blood and lymph. Go do a sauna, do cold plunge, exercise, hang upside down, gap massage, anything you could do to move blood and lymph. And then the last thing would be to just eliminate through your emunctories. Your emunctories are the portals where things come out of your body. Tears, urine, bowels, sweat, nose, vaginal, all of the things where stuff can come out we want to make sure that's open. So poop every day, take magnesium, make sure you're getting fiber in, make sure you're getting lots of water in with minerals, like a pinch of sea salt. And so those I think would be really good foundational places to start. So when in doubt, do that, see where all the cards kind of lie, look at the 9 types of anxiety, and then use that to help you narrow in on other specifiers that you might want.
That makes total sense. That's really helpful. And then in terms of the psychospiritual, you talk about the bottom up versus the top down, which I thought was very interesting because you say, a lot of traditional psychospiritual work is top down. So the brain controlling the body, as we talked about in the beginning, but you're a big advocate of bottom up approaches. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about those. And, obviously it starts with the body and then goes to the brain. How does that work? And which are your favorite therapies?
I love therapies that involve therapeutic self-touch and self-massage. And so placing your hand on your shoulders and feeling the weight of your hand on your shoulders, massaging. I love Qigong, where it's moving the body in intentional ways, shifting and moving energy. There's ways that in Qigong, they're talking about like cupping your hands. So you kind of make a cup and then you can gently tap on different meridians. And so that can move energy. I kind of think about it like every time my dog, I like pick her up and I put her in the car, she'll shake off and then settle down. Or I'll take her out of the car and she'll shake off. And so I think I love that. It's just like clearing the energy from the body. I had a transcendental meditation teacher once who was teaching me just to be in the body and just to be in the breath and don't pay attention to the thoughts. The thoughts are irrelevant, he would say. And so I'm like practicing my TM. And then I'm like, oh my God, I had this amazing realization. So I call him. I'm like, Charles, I just had this huge insight. I'm so excited. And he's like, it doesn't matter. And I'm like, but it does. This was like the entire answer to my problem. He's like, your brain likes to think. And it just grabs a hold of stress and energy that's coming out of the body, and it tries to grab a hold of it and make meaning. Our brains are meaning-making machines, but just release it. Just notice it. Just look at the body. So I love that. I love anything, touch, temperature, yoga, qigong, anything that moves the body and allows that to just come out without us having to fix it, analyze it, or change it.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because we know, for instance, that 80% of the vagal nerves are afferent, meaning that they go from the organs to the brain and not the other way around. And so it makes
Yeah.
sense that actually the portal to our mental health or to our mental wellness is through the body and through this sort of network of nerves that goes from the organs to the brain rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
And you talk about parts work, you talk about EMDR, somatic experiencing. Are those, I mean, I suppose the difference is that those you have to practice with a practitioner as opposed to self. And I love what you said about Qigong and yoga and self touch, because those are things that are very accessible. Anyone can do those. But, would you also advocate working with a therapist to do those more somatic therapies?
Yeah, I love finding your good, right, happy healer. There is an exercise I teach. It's called the 3-minute hack, which I'd love to introduce briefly so that somebody can have a little parts work activity that they can start doing on their own, if that would be okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what the 3-minute hack is it's designed to be done in 3 minutes, and you can do it every day as just practice so that you know how to use it when you need it most, or you can use it just if something happens and the stressor happens. So let's say that you're sitting at your computer, you're sitting at your desk, you get an email, and the email is you screwed something up or you missed a deadline or something, and you get this jolt of anxiety and you get this jolt of stress, and you start noticing your brain is catastrophizing and your heart is beating fast. Now, traditional models would say just breathe, cope your way out of it, take a little bit of kava kava, whatever you could do to make it go away. But the 3-minute hack allows us to use that activating experience for deeper healing. So, what you're going to do is you're going to get up and relocate yourself because the brain is so associative. We want to relocate ourselves. So, if you're at work, go to a bathroom and sit in the bathroom stall, go to your car, go outside, and then somewhere where you have privacy, where you're not going to be interrupted, and you're going to set your alarm for 60 seconds. And then, if you feel comfortable, you're going to butterfly hug, where your hands are going to be on opposite shoulders. And then you're just going to notice yourself getting into the breath. And for 60 seconds, I want you to notice exactly how you felt in the body and how you felt in your emotions and the thoughts that came to your mind when you got that email or when that activating event occurred. And you're just going to lean into it. You're just going to notice it. You're going to be tapping left, right, left, right, left, right. The tapping helps you stay in your body. It helps you stay in the present. You're crossing the midline of the brain by crossing your arms. It's a little bit of a gentle hug, and you're just going to notice it. Your alarm will go off, and then you're going to set it for another 60 seconds. In that second 60 seconds, you're going to go down the timeline because very likely that email coming in activated you maybe in a bigger way because of some sort of an ice cube in your cup. Like there may have been something there that made you vulnerable to it. So you're going to go down the timeline. And I want you to remember the earliest time that you can think of where you felt this exact same way. Oh, I felt this in my chest before. Oh, I felt this panic. Oh, I felt this shame. Oh, I felt this whenever that was. And you're going to notice that earliest moment. And I want you to notice that. I want you to bring that memory to mind. I want you to remember that. And then your alarm will go off. And this is the last step. The last 60 seconds is now you're going to timestamp that. Time stamping is important because stressors and adversity don't always get stored to the brain that have language or time. So they get activated and it feels like we're stuck back in the past. It's a reenactment. The world's the stage and every situation is just a different set of actors. So you're going to go back to that original part. You're going to keep tapping, and for the last 60 seconds, this is what I want you to say. Okay, part. I hear you. And I want to thank you so much for talking to me and telling me what you need and telling me what's coming up for you. And I honor you and I'm grateful for you, part. And I want you to know that I'm listening and I've got you and that we are no longer in the past, that it is the present. It is 2024, 2025, whatever year it is. It is the present moment. And I have resources now. I have knowledge now that you didn't have then. And I want you to let me take care of you. And I would love to ask you to trust me and set down this heavy burden that you've been carrying, this heavy burden of trying to take care of me and protect me, and just set that down. And then in those last couple of seconds is imagine that part taking all of that pressure, all of that stress, all of those memories, all of that responsibility, all of those yucky sensations, and putting them in a backpack or a box and set that aside. And then sometimes we want to take that and we want to send it to the sun. Sometimes we want to give it to the higher power. We want to burn it. Whatever it is fine. And you're going to think that part and you're going to let it go. Your alarm will go off and then you go back to work.
Amazing. That's awesome. I love that. That's really fantastic. And it's something very practical that people can try. And that makes sense. And speaking of practicality, because I know we've overstayed we've overstayed our time, but I just wanted to ask you one final thing, which was in your book, you have very practical approaches, just as you did now, but to panic. And so you have, a panic pack, which I love that concept, like a panic pack. And, so what are, in a nutshell, sort of a few essential tips for panic attacks? If you're starting to feel an anxiety attack come upon you, what are the practical tips that you can action then and there? And I've got a list here from your book, which I will not go into. I'll let you talk about it. But there were a few really good ones.
Try to do your stoplight strategy. So figure out what it feels like in the mind, your body, your thoughts when you're calm and in the green. And then draw that, write it all out. And then the second is figure out activities, thoughts, activators, sensations when you're in the orange or yellow, and then do the same thing when you're in the red. Because the earlier you can catch it, if you can hear the body's whispers, you won't have to wait for the shouts.
Yeah.
But the panic pack is good for when you're in all stages, but it's good for the shouts. And so neurophysiologically, what we see happening, especially during acute crisis, is the emotional brain, the amygdala, gets really, really activated, and it overrides other parts of the brain, like the more rational prefrontal cortex. And then the amygdala activates just the reptilian part of the brain that's like, run from danger. So things that are going to help you the very most, I put in a panic pack, and those are things that are going to stimulate touch or smell or taste or temperature or sound. So I use the mnemonic TIPS, which is standing on the shoulders of the giant Marshall Linehan, the founder of dialectical behavioral therapy. And I just added more things to it. So it's TIPS. And so you have that in the book, but it's tipping the temperature, and you can get online. She talked about sticking your face in a bucket of ice water and how that can be really fast at stopping a panic attack. But practically speaking, we don't carry around buckets of ice water. So the next best thing is you could get these little chemical packs, just like a first aid kit. You get it, you can buy them by the box. They're small, they fit in your pocket, your purse, your desk, your glove box, your kids' backpack. And you just shake it up. There's a chemical reaction, and then you just place it over the eyes. And you would do it for maybe 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, 30 seconds on. Some people like it over their chest. They like it over the back of their neck. That's like cooling the body. But over the eyes, we see stimulation of the parasympathetic nervous system. Scent is awesome. And so lavender has been studied. We can inhale it. We can get absorption into the cribriform plate and go directly to the hypothalamus, the brain. And that can cause the parasympathetic nervous system to create calm. We also can get a production of GABA from inhalation. We can apply some essential oils like lavender topically. They can absorb through the skin. We can absorb it and get a boost of GABA. Reduction of cortisol. Rose is another well-studied one. I always teach on having 2 oils though, because you want to use one that's like, okay, I'm anxious. I'm huffing my lavender. I'm using lavender. But then you want something else after, like citrus or something that's like a reset. It's like, okay, now we're done. We're moving into a new state. And then sound is great. So I use earbuds. And so if you're overstimulated and your salience network is getting flooded, maybe you want noise cancellation, or maybe you want binaural beats, or maybe you want alpha stimulation, alpha wave music. Maybe you want to listen to a podcast like this amazing podcast that we're on right now. Sound.
Yeah.
There's other ones that are in the book though, but those are some of my faves.
Yeah, those are fantastic. And also like the rough stone and the smooth stone, the
Yeah.
bubbles, you know, the intense exercise. So one of the things I found fascinating is if you're sort of going into a panic attack, you just start doing intense aerobic exercise. I'd never thought of that, but that, you know, that apparently can work quite well. And then the other thing is breathing. And for me personally, I cured my panic attacks, and I was having about 5 a day at one point, just through a very simple breathing technique, which a psychologist taught me. And, you know, it was so simple, but he recorded it on my phone. And every time I felt I was sort of in the orange, as you would say, in the traffic light system, the key was getting it in the orange before it went to the red, because it was much harder to get back once you were in the red. But it was like this very simple, you know, count to 4 and then hold for 4 and then breathe out for 8. But he did it on my phone. It was like a metronome. And that really helped, because I knew I had that tool to stop the panic attacks in their tracks. And I think half the battle is losing the fear of the fear, essentially, and losing the fear that you're going to lose control and you're going to have this panic attack, and knowing that you have the tool to stop it. So I love your tips about the cold and the scents and the earbuds and, you know, all the things that are in your book, which are really helpful and which are very concrete, that can really help you interrupt that cycle of getting on the panic roller coaster, essentially.
Yeah, that power, that sense of, that's the key thing with anxiety as opposed to just fear. Is anxiety is when we get that activation and that arousal out of context of danger and with a sense of disempowerment. And so as opposed to like, I'm actually being chased by a tiger and I have natural fear and I'm rescuing myself by running from the tiger, as opposed to if you're getting ready to drive on a road trip and you're like, what if I have a panic attack in the car and I can't get out? So I love that you're saying is like that what can I do that I know will combat it? And so if you're somebody who needs to carry around that emergency Xanax, put that in your panic pack if your doctor's given that to you. But then try the other things maybe first and see if the 4-count breath that you were talking about, Kirkland, if that works. And then you don't need the Xanax, but you have it there like a handicap blanket, you know, you have your comfort blanket.
I think that's so important. And, you know, one of the doctors that we saw, my mother also had panic attacks, and he always gave her this diazepam or whatever, one of the benzos. And, you know, he said, well, try not to use it, but if you really need to, it's there. And that was enough of a security blanket to reduce the stress that was coming with the fear of losing control and having this panic attack. And so I think you're right. Like, knowing that you have this whole toolbox of on a spectrum, the worst sort of being the benzos, which, you know, have so many side effects and can be very addictive and can damage your gut. But you have all these other factors that and tools at your disposal that are so beautifully outlined in your book that you can rely on and you know, resort to before you go full spectrum, basically.
Yeah. I love it. And you can make the panic pack glamorous. I did a segment on Tamron Hall and we made it so glamorous. We got like the most blingin' bag. It was super cute. You wouldn't feel weird taking that out with your friends. And then we put in like yummy oils and some sour candies and a little kava kava. And so just have fun with it, get creative. These little fidgets, like the spiky fidget is like my favorite and nobody knows. It's like a cute little bling and ring. And it's so good, subtle, portable. So have fun with it.
Yeah, because sensation and touch is so important to get you back in
Yeah.
your body, right? So things with texture, whether it's, a fluffy blanket or whether it's that little bling thing that you showed us. I mean,
Yeah.
those are totally grounding and super effective. And the
Yeah.
last point before I let you go, and I will let you go, is microdosing, because, there's so much around psychedelics and the power of psychedelics within the context of therapy to really help with people with anxiety and depression. What is your view? Because you do have a little bit on microdosing for anxiety. What is your experience with that, and what's your view?
I think that there's a lot of herbs and mushrooms and plants that are beautifully and wonderfully therapeutic. I've studied herbalism for more than a decade, and I love using herbs. I love using herbs in the context of the greater environment. And so if you go and you find chamomile, it very rarely will just grow in just a crop of straight up chamomile. And we evolved alongside chamomile with other plants. And so I think that tinctures and herbs tend to work better with their companions. I think that using them individually is nice for research so that we can say, I gave someone chamomile and then I did an oat test or a spinal tap or whatever, blood pressure test, or it's easier to say this causes this when we have just one variable. Um, and so I like the idea of psilocybin and natural psychedelic therapies. I think they have great therapeutic potential, and I'm eager to see us using them with their companion herbs. And so, say, Tess, you had, I know you got to talk to Pam there, where when they teach about it, they're using psilocybin with lion's mane and reishi and other mushrooms that tend to be synergistic. And so I like that. And I love how, like we were talking about earlier with microdosing, and sometimes for the right person, a macro can help us see reduced connectivity in the default mode network, which is, again, that more self referential, dissociative anxiety network, and help us feel a greater sense of connectivity to the world around us and others. And we're seeing amazing neuroplastic growth, less anxiety. And so I'm really excited about that. I think that we're just at the beginning, and I think we can do better. I think it's going to be good.
I agree, and I like your point about, the conjunction. It's almost like the toolbox. You have the psilocybin, and the other psychedelics, but you also have other tools. You have the mushrooms, you have the herbs. You mentioned ashwagandha in your book, which I know is a very powerful Ayurvedic herb, which is an
Yeah.
adaptogen and which really helps or can help with anxiety. And you talk about kava kava, you talk about, there are a whole number, chamomilla. There's so many herbs that we
Mhm.
have access to. And I think I think these psychedelics are incredibly powerful and are certainly very much the rage at the moment. And I think for a good reason. But I love the fact that you put it into a wider context, because I think that's important, because there's so many tools in the plant arsenal that we can
Yeah.
use that are very powerful. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, all women should know about wild asparagus, shatavari. Are you familiar with that one?
No, I don't. I've never heard of it.
Oh, girl, that plant is like a superstar for women. So, what ashwagandha is for men, it's like the tropho restorative. Earlier, we were talking about tonifying, strengthening the nervous system, the brain, the hormones, healing the endocrine system. So, what ashwagandha is for men, shatavari or wild asparagus is for women. It increases libido. It makes us more vital. It makes us more resilient. It makes us, it decreases inflammation. It increases neuroplastic connectivity. Like, this plant is like, wow, she's amazing.
Wow.
And it's like you said, everyone is so pumped about psychedelic mushrooms right now. And I'm like, you guys haven't even like seen like you haven't even like gotten into it. You just wait. There's a whole world of these glorious plants. They're just I walk through Michigan and there's like Leonoris or motherwort just growing right there. And I'm like, someone with anxiety could eat this plant every day for the next 3 weeks and they might not have anxiety anymore when they're done. It's growing right here.
That's amazing. What is that plant called?
Leonoris.
Leon
Leonoris is motherwort.
Motherwort. Amazing. Yeah, because I mean, you're also a herbalist, right? And so
Yeah.
I mean, that's also fantastic. I mean, herbs are so incredibly powerful. Well, look, there's all this amazing information in your book. I mean, it is so exhaustive, and there are tables of all these herbs that you can take. And I mean, I highly, highly recommend it. It really is an encyclopedia. If you have any sort of tendency towards anxiety or panic, this is your book, really. And it's very comprehensive. And so hats off and well done. And where can people find you, Nicole?
Come find me on Instagram. I love hanging out there. It's Dr. Nicole Cain, and it's DrNicoleCain. And Panic Proof is anywhere books are sold. Woo!
Amazing. And you have a website?
I do. It's drnicolecain.com.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, Dr. Nicole Cain, thank you so, so much for your time. I'm so grateful. I think there have been some wonderful pearls of wisdom. And here's to all those who are suffering from anxiety and panic. And I know that there are legions out there, and I really hope that this will help them, because it's really not easy when you have that. But there is hope. And as you say in your book, you know, you can heal from anxiety. I think you and I are two examples. I mean, obviously, it's a lifelong journey and it's a daily practice in some ways, but it does work. And so, you know, keep up the great work.
Thank you. And thanks for having me. It's been so fun.
Thank you so much for listening to the Mind Health 360 show. I hope that we've helped you realize that mental health symptoms have root causes that can and need to be addressed in order to sustainably heal, and have given you some ideas about steps you, your loved ones, or clients may take to start their healing journey. Please share this interview with anyone you think may find it helpful, and don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date with our latest interviews on integrative mental health. If you want further information, please go to www.mindhealth360.com or find us on social media. This information is for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease or to replace medical advice. Please always consult your healthcare practitioner before discontinuing any medication or implementing any changes in your diet, lifestyle, or supplement program.